Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security at the Heritage Foundation. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com. My guest today is Ben Delman, Editorial Director at Solar United Neighbors, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to helping people go solar and fight for their energy rights. Delman has been instrumental in the organization's growth from its inception in 2007 to its current status as a leading advocate for solar energy. His role involves educating the public about solar energy, facilitating the installation of solar panels, and supporting community solar projects. Delman's work has been recognized with a nomination for the Independent Media Institute's Independent Media Award for his effort in public education and community engagement. He also has expertise with the steel industry and their supply chain, which is what brings him to us today. With that, Ben, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Yeah, Steve, thank you so much for having me. We're very much looking forward to this conversation.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time, and I think you've got a few different interesting tidbits that our audience ought to appreciate. Before we get to the meat of the conversation, shared before the program, we like to get to know the guest and let the audience hear a little bit about the human being we're talking to today before we get into solar panels and steel and supply chains and China's decisions and all that fun stuff. But as you were kind of coming up in life, did you think you were going to just go into this kind of an industry? Was there a particular part along the way that nudged you in the direction, or did you kind of grow up saying, I want to be a fireman?
Well, actually, that was one of my first jobs that I wanted until I learned that the hours were pretty bad. Lots of waking up in the middle of the night. So as a 3 and 4 year old, that sort of deterred me from being a firefighter. But it is interesting. I remember as a child reading this book about jobs, and one of the lines of the book was, the job you may have may not be invented yet. And as a 4 or 5 year old, that was very much true. The solar industry was nowhere near certainly where it is today, or even when I started back in the 2000s. And that's really where I spent most of my career, working in and around solar. And so I think have a somewhat unique perspective, but have been, as you mentioned, with Solar United Neighbors here for the past decade or so, helping people learn about solar, join with fellow solar supporters, and I think most importantly, maybe for our conversation today, fighting for policies that help more people benefit from solar energy.
Well, I appreciate that. And since we're also going to be talking about steel and those supply chains too, maybe share a little bit about how you got your feet in those waters.
Sure. So I think, being involved with the solar industry and having worked with companies sort of up and down the supply chain, have gotten to understand that solar isn't just the panels that are generating electricity, but also the steel racking that's holding those systems in place. It's also the inverter components that are changing the electricity from the DC power that's created to the AC power that homes use. So there's all of these sort of intricate components of solar that, if you're communicating about it as I've been for almost the last 20 years, it's things that you need to be cognizant of and understand really well to be able to explain to folks.
Yeah, well, it seems to me, certainly over the course of my lifetime, a lot of the facts of this industry and technology have changed, but also not just the components, but where they're made. So maybe merging into the meat of what we want to talk about today, share your observations of what the evolution has been in terms of the days when solar panel was something I might get from a Boy's Life magazine that was going to power a little gadget to scatter along the table or the sidewalk, to solar that is actually doing meaningful things. where was that stuff made originally, and what has shifted in terms of the origins of the raw materials and the manufacturing?
Yeah, I think we've seen tremendous growth in the American manufacturing of solar. In 2017, the United States ranked 14th in the world in solar manufacturing. Today, we're the world's third largest solar manufacturer. So, as consumer, commercial, industrial interest in solar has grown, so too has the American solar market.
Well, what about the components themselves? So we're tinkering around with this stuff 20, 30 years ago,
Mhm.
smaller scale, but also where did the raw materials tend to come from, and where were the panels and things being manufactured?
Yeah, I think we are still seeing a lot of that manufacturing happening overseas in
Yeah.
primarily Asian countries. Um, and I think as we think about looking forward, how do we build American manufacturing? What are the policies needed here locally to build that base up? One of the things that I've been working on with some folks in Ohio is a bill called community energy. The idea there is that if you're a renter or you just have a roof that's maybe got a big oak tree in the yard, you can't install solar panels on your home, right? So the idea with community energy is you can buy a share of an offsite solar array, have the electricity that it generates be credited to your bill the same as it would if it were on your rooftop. And the great thing about that is, as I mentioned previously, with those kinds of systems, you need to build sort of a steel frame around that racking, and that's steel manufacturing that can be done right here in the United States. Here, particularly Ohio, Pennsylvania, sort of the what we call the Rust Belt, right? And so there's real, I think,
Mhm.
opportunity if we put the policies in place to strengthen American manufacturing.
Well, that's definitely where we want to go with the conversation. But let's start talking back at the beginning of that arc. So,
Mhm.
share some of your expertise on kind of where a lot of these technologies and at scale manufacturing platforms have been. And that is kind of what brings you to the China desk. There's
Mhm.
an awful lot of this in recent decades that has been talking about scaling up massively for global markets, not just for the United States, where
Mhm.
it's gone to China, and it has a whole host of issues associated with it. So maybe share with us your observations about what the reality of that scaling up is, and sort of what the weight of supply and market that China has
Mhm.
played, and then you can continue to educate us on where the trends are moving, maybe in balanced directions from there.
Sure, Steve. I think um, the balance of the panels over certainly my time in the industry, I think has shifted towards Asia, towards China, as those have been I think drivers of the panel side of manufacturing. But I think also that's only one part of the whole supply chain, right? So you can you know build even if you're manufacturing the panels overseas, you can't install them overseas, and so there are local parts of the supply chain, local parts of the job creation chain, as I would say, that still kind of have to be done in America. There's not a hammer long enough to reach across the Pacific Ocean, but yeah, I'm not speaking out of school here to say that a lot of that manufacturing has been overseas.
Well, so in both steel and solar,
Mm.
China has empirically moved pretty far ahead and fast,
Mhm.
and they tend to use their leverage from time to time. In your sense, has the scale and the role that they have come to play in this supply chain affected the move for broader adoption of these technologies, or the broader supply of these technologies in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've certainly seen cost declines in solar. A lot of that is because of production, from from these overseas manufacturers, and that's been certainly a driver of cost declines. And with that, obviously, adoption is it's more more affordable for people and companies to invest in the technology. But I think as there has been more interest in solar, there's been more opportunities for manufacturing here in the States, as well as you know we work primarily with solar homeowners, prospective solar homeowners. And certainly I think one of the things that a lot of folks care about, and I'm sure your audience cares about, is, okay, where are these panels manufactured? How are they manufactured? And so there's, I think, a certain brand value, right, to having something made in America.
For sure. Well, and one of the issues in terms of manufacturing in China is that we know that there are subsidies involved in that process. There have at different times been subsidies in the American system, but the difference is that what's done in the American system is completely transparent. And it's basically equal playing field for those that are in the American market. And the subsidies on both the steel and the solar side in China can be quite significant. What's your sense on sort of those numerical challenges? Is the subsidization game in China also kind of creating competitive challenges for manufacturing in the United States for these things and broader adoption?
Well, and sure, as you and your audience may know, the solar tax credits that were in place and have been in place since 2007, 2008, are, well, they're ending at the end of the year for residential solar, and then winding down over the next couple of years for commercial solar. So there really isn't, from an American perspective or American side of the ledger, any federal subsidies any longer. And so I think that certainly changes the balance of the balance of the markets, where it's just not something that American consumers have access to any longer.
So maybe share a little bit. You mentioned a couple of locations, perhaps, that America thinks of in not so complimentary terms as the Rust Belt, but basically where the steel industry has been known and manufacturing was humming along for some time before the effects of globalization in recent decades. But Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana come to mind as places that powered American industry for generations. How could strengthening U.S. solar and steel sectors really serve both as an economic strategy, but also in maybe a geopolitical counterweight to China's overinfluence?
Sure. And so I think when we're talking about growth potential, I think something we really see is the advent of artificial intelligence, AI, right? That these data centers are massive energy users, right? And so we know that solar energy is the quickest, least expensive way to get new electrons on the grid. And so, we see a lot of opportunity there to, I think, one, power these data centers, but also do it in a way where small businesses and residences aren't having to pay the extra cost for the data load, the energy load that these new data centers are going to require. I think certainly Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, those are all places where data centers are popping up. And so this is, I think, an opportunity that when paired with solar, paired with storage, paired with technology that can help individual homeowners, small businesses better control where the energy comes from, is a really potentially fruitful marriage to establish American dominance in this emerging sector.
Yeah. I think for consumers too, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, there are a lot of things that we do in our everyday life where we want or need reliable access to energy, but it's not the overconsumption of energy like a data center or a big manufacturing plant where they're hungry and they need to be fed and run 24/7, 365. But the combination of solar and battery storage for people in remote areas to have as a backup in times of storm or other kinds of disasters or what have you, there's low grade energy demand needs that this combo of American manufacturing and steel and manufacturing of these products together with solar and batteries can help balance that demand. And if the traditional grid is being used to feed some of these big manufacturing hubs, which is a legit use of it, that's going to be a lot of demand, meaning driving price up. And so this solar and storage option can not only be yours to control and have access to, but also really cost effective when compared to increased demand. And so the AI boom, I think, probably is a big demand for energy, and this is where the all of the above approach to energy comes into play. Anything in that I missed, or you'd revise or extend?
Well, I think to extend, it's not just what happens when a storm hits, but for somebody who maybe relies on medical equipment to either keep medicine refrigerated or keep uh, you know like a oxygen machine or something like that. Electricity isn't just an issue of comfort, right? It's an issue of life and death. So pairing solar and storage is a way to make sure that folks are protected when the power goes out.
Yeah. Maybe share a little bit about the steel industry. We think when Americans think about steel, and you can give a window into. You've talked about frames and other things, but where are you and the people associated with your enterprise looking as the primary sources for the steel that goes into the products that you're advocating, and what do you see as kind of the policies, whether it's federal government, state government, otherwise, ought to be looking at to make it more abundant, more affordable, but basically more readily available to apply for the uses you're looking at?
Yeah, so about 1 to 1.5% of steel manufactured in the U.S. already goes to use for use in solar. And so when I think we talk about policy, so much of energy policy is really made at the state and local level. So I talked about Ohio earlier with this community energy bill. Pennsylvania is considering something similar. I think another policy that we have identified as important. It is important to not just solar owners, but to really everybody who wants a more affordable, reliable electric grid is net metering, right? Making sure that solar owners earn a fair credit for the electricity that they generate, but maybe don't use themselves. So, let's say it's a sunny day, you're away, your system's producing, your lights aren't on, you're probably producing more than you're using. And so that electricity goes out to your neighbors who are using it, and we want to make sure that you're getting a fair credit for that solar. So and something like net metering is usually at a state level or even sometimes sort of utility by utility, and so making sure that we're, I think you said earlier, keeping solar on a level playing field is a way to encourage investment in ancillary industries like steel.
Yeah, well, we tend to look at things too from a little bit of a geostrategic competition point of view. A lot of people talk about China being very far ahead in just the technologies and deployment of these kinds of technologies. But what do you see as sort of the state of play for American industry adoption deployment? And you've also hinted a couple of different times that, solar panels are what, and maybe solar farms would be what a lot of people think of when it comes to solar. But you've kind of alluded that there are maybe some other use cases, applications that the average bear might think about. Maybe share a little bit about that, with especially the flavor of this is an area of American innovation where we are competitive.
Exactly, and I think it is much more. If you look at the where we are versus where China is, I think it's much more on the deployment side than the technology side. I think technology is pretty level, sort of across the world. It's they've deployed more solar than we have as they have developed it, and so I think we talked a little bit about sort of larger scale solar, but also community solar tends to be, I would consider that more small scale, right? Because you're not that electricity isn't being bought and sold by utility. It's usually sort of sent. The ownership model is different than sort of like the large scale uh, systems you might see like out in the Nevada desert. But I think something that's emerging, and actually Utah was the first state to just pass a bill around called like balcony solar, basically a system that's two or three panels connected to a plug that you can literally just plug in. And so that's something I think you'll see a lot of in the coming year, where, again, as I said, solar energy policy is very much made at the state level. And so you'll see, I think, lawmakers across the country from both parties, looking for a place to cut red tape around these really small systems. Like I said, maybe two or three panels that people can, once it's up and running, or once the industry is more up and running, go to the hardware store, get some panels, plug them in, and then, able to offset a little bit of their energy. So I think that the plug-in solar is, I think, an opportunity for the United States to really, um, you know, explore a new way to help people generate their own electricity. But I also see it as, if you're somebody who's still learning about solar, maybe doesn't want to make, a big, 12, 15, $20,000 investment, for a couple $1,000s, maybe, again, depending on the market, let me try out these panels for a couple years, see if that works. And then if it does, okay, that's proof positive. Let me make this bigger investment into rooftop solar. So that's something, watching the market, that I'm really, really excited about.
So there's a lot of talk lately in news media and frankly U.S.-China relations about rare earths. So maybe share a little bit about whether or what parts of that conversation are relevant to the discussion about solar. Because, to the uninitiated, which I would include myself to a degree in terms of how solar panels are manufactured and all the components, that just looks like some kind of plastic glass contraption or what have you out there. But share a little bit about what some of the science is, or what some of those components might be for that manufacturing process, and are they caught up in this tug of war about rare earths and critical minerals?
Sure. And so I would say, I guess, first, rare earths is a bit of a misnomer, and it's
Yeah.
not, they're not rare in that they're necessarily hard to find, or a small amount of, but that's just the scientific name, given to them. So, panels mostly silicon glass, as you mentioned, and then silver, which is probably the most expensive part of the panel. That's what actually conducts the electricity. And so, I think certainly, the question around, where are we mining and sourcing materials is an important one. I think it's also the case, as we kind of see this with other mining industries, right? Where as demand for something increases, more potential sources come online or become profitable. So I think that as the industry matures, the United States, as demand grows, I think there certainly are opportunities to develop new sources of these materials.
So, I mean, when we talk about mining and processing, there's also sort of the logic of a lot of global conversation and policy that's looked at counting carbons and environmental policy generally. It's not the meat and potatoes of this program, but it is kind of one of the interesting ironies we've dealt with over and over, though, that in order to get something that many people, but not all, opting to try out solar are thinking, hey, I'd like to do something that would have a mild impact on the environment. But then the countries that are mining and refining the raw materials that make that are not so responsible or friendly for the planet. And so, leaving aside what's motivating for people to opt in for solar, but just take it as a given that people are looking to be responsible stewards of the resources we have. Do you also see that there is just that much more of an imperative that we're doing more of this by ourselves and for ourselves and among sort of the responsible stakeholder community, that maybe mining and refining is dirtier than the average job, but it'll be cleaner if done by us than if it's done by a lower regulation state like China?
Sure. And I think the other thing I would add to the conversation too is the recycling piece of it, right? That, these panels are warranted usually to last 20, 25 years. And so we really haven't built a robust recycling end of life industry yet, just because there hasn't been the demand for it. But I think that's something, in the next, honestly, 5 to 10 years, we're going to see more of. And so find new ways to be efficient with, the materials that we already have. But I think, Steve, to your question too, our organization's role really is as, I think, a consumer watchdog and really consumer advocate. And so making sure that solar customers are informed about what goes into making the panels, where they're made, because that, to your point, is I think important to a lot of solar consumers.
Yeah. Well, I think I cut you off, or we took the conversation in a little different direction before. I teased you out about maybe some of the applications for solar that are not just the panels we see. So that, you made an allusion earlier that piqued my curiosity as a young geek at one point in my life, and I really am interested in sort of the application of these sciences, in addition to making sure that we're doing things that put us in a more resilient, less dependent ecosystem generally. So, what are some of the other use cases for solar, the applications of solar that people might not readily identify as they see things on someone's roof? Or you mentioned the fold out on the deck or things like that, but what are some of the other ways that solar is working into our American energy or livelihood ecosystem that we don't see or think about?
Yeah, so I think you're certainly starting to see, a little bit as electric vehicles become more widely adopted. And I think, frankly, and I want to talk about this aspect too, because I think it's important, as battery storage technology improves, I think for the longest time, and by longest, I mean 150, 200 years, there wasn't as much investment or interest in battery storage because electricity was always really cheap to produce. That's less and less the case these days. And so there's been more investment into battery storage. And so, what can we do with battery storage? How can that, to, play on the old cliche, like how is this better mousetrap able to improve our energy system? And what I think we're seeing is a shift from sort of the old centralized utility model, where you have a big centralized power plant that is distributing electricity over long distances, to one where you have solar and battery storage on your home, I have solar and battery storage where I live. And so we're able to not only be energy consumers, but also energy producers, and produce for ourselves when demand is highest. And so we're seeing sort of new ways to use solar that isn't just, I've got it on my home and it's powering my electricity, but also I'm able to store that, provide it to my neighbors, and provide resiliency for the grid in times of high demand or if there's a storm.
Yeah. Well, I have a friend, and hopefully I'm not saying anything out of school because I don't know what's patented or what's not and all that other stuff, but it's an interesting idea, and I don't think that it is one that would be easily taken from him. But a friend who is looking at application of solar and generator technology so that whether you're in an urban area and you've got a lot of construction going on, the generators that they're using can be quite loud. So whether you're motivated because of emissions, which is, I would admit, not my first motivation, but I can definitely be annoyed by noise, and that's another way that application of solar to run a generator that keeps those torch lights up and going, so the construction crew can work at night. So working quietly at night with redundancy is kind of a nice thing. And then there's the use of that same thing if you're going out to road construction or remote areas or whatever else. You can have something that is storing some of that energy when the sun is shining, and then these are low energy needed uses that would again be quiet, also low emission, and as long as you can manufacture it at an effective price, then it's sort of a why not. So with that, maybe as we sort of come around the bend, share with us what role you see in trade policies or other things that we should have at state, federal, or other levels that make it so that we're doing things in a sensible way, but also with rational prices. That are not, you mentioned the subsidies going away, fine, then we don't have price distortion in our own market. But how do we, what do we need to be doing to create the right environment for this to be a competitive use case?
Sure. And I think one more thing on the generator piece, in addition to the running silent, also think about if you have, a fossil fuel generator, gasoline powered generator, and, storm hits,
Yep.
roads are out, lines for fuel might be long. If you've got solar and battery storage, your fuel line is, right up to the sky. So, I think that's another use case that I think your audience would be interested in. But on the policy side, I think a lot of it is cutting red tape, right? So if you look at Australia, which is I think pretty leaps and bounds in a lot of ways ahead of us on on solar, particularly rooftop residential solar, and a lot of that is because they're permitting and interconnection, the process by which your utility gives you the thumbs up to turn your system on is much more streamlined. And so as we're talking about policies, what can we do to reduce the time between a solar customer signing the ink on their contract and them actually generating electrons? And I think the best way to do that is just to streamline permitting and interconnection so that we're able to cut costs there and save installers some time and money.
Well, as a Florida resident who had family weathering some pretty powerful storms last year, knock wood, not so much this hurricane season, and then relatives who went through another bad storm season the year prior that went a little south of us, the idea of being able to have some kind of independent solar power access to keep a generator going when there verifiably were long fuel lines and there was some wait time to get things up and going. That actually is quite important. And as you mentioned, for those that have real medical needs, it's an absolute game changer. And as long as we can make sure that the regulation is made rational and out of the way, we're manufacturing things in America for Americans, and you're giving people options, not forcing them to take these options. There's I think some interesting pro-America, pro-market, and frankly pro-independence and resilience for all of the prepper friends that might be out there that like to try to live off the grid part of the time, that sort of fit that American spirit. And hopefully it's an area where we can be truly competitive in terms of what China has been doing, and we also lessen that dependency on the manufacturing side. Very, very important priority across the board, not just this industry. But as we get toward that end, please share with our audience any final thoughts, and also where they should go to track your work and observations about trends in this realm.
Yeah, so I think if folks have questions about honestly any of the technologies or the things that we talked about today, I strongly encourage them to visit our free solar help desk. We've got an email and phone line set up for folks who have questions about solar really at any step of the process. So whether you're just looking into the technology or if you've installed the system and have questions about how it's working, we can provide guidance. That's at www.solarunitedneighbors.org.
Excellent. Well, with that, Ben, we want to thank you very much for sharing your time with us. To our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends, consider subscribing, and give a visit to ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you again for joining. Thank you to Ben Delman for sharing his perspectives. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.